The child who appears only in photograph. The photographs of little Lila. Long ago in the sleepy hills of Kentucky, nestled between forests as thick as a dream, there was a small town called Black Hollow. It was a town known for its old ways, steeped in traditions passed down like whispered secrets, where the land seemed to hum with something ancient beneath its surface. In Black Hollow, they say the air always carried a certain heaviness, like a promise made long ago, never to be broken. One day, a family moved into the house on the edge of town, the one with the broken gate and overgrown ivy crawling up the sides like fingers of the past reaching for the sky. The Murphys, Matthew, his wife Sarah, and their young daughter Lila, came from the bustling city, looking for a fresh start after the untimely death of Sarah's sister Alice, who had passed in the early spring. The locals welcomed them with warm smiles, but there was an unease in the air whenever the Murphys walked into town. The elders of Black Hollow spoke little, their faces shadowed with memories of things they never said aloud. But there was one thing they all agreed on: the house on the hill had always been cursed. The land it stood on had a history that went back long before the Murphys moved there. As the days passed, young Lila began to explore the woods behind the house, and it didn't take long for the first strange occurrence to happen. One afternoon, Matthew Murphy sat in the front room, sorting through his old photographs. They had just unpacked their belongings, and there in the back of the box was an old camera, a relic from Sarah's family. It was an antique, the kind you'd see in an old country store, its brass fittings tarnished by time, but still gleaming like it had a story to tell. It was a perfect fit for Black Hollow, where memories seemed to cling to the past. "Sarah, look at this," Matthew called to his wife, who was sweeping the kitchen. She entered the room, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's the old camera, isn't it? I haven't seen that in years." Matthew smiled. "I think it still works. I'll give it a try." And so, as evening fell, Sarah and Matthew decided to take a family photo. They found young Lila playing near the old stone well outside, her laughter ringing in the air like the sound of something not entirely from this world. "Come here, darling, let's take a photo," Sarah called, her voice warm with affection. Lila ran over, her small feet barely touching the ground, and smiled her usual bright smile, a smile that lit up the world around her. Matthew adjusted the camera, his hands fumbling with the settings as the sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long eerie shadows across the yard. With a click, the photo was taken. At first, everything seemed normal. They took the picture, the three of them standing in front of the old well with the fading sunlight shining through the trees. But as the photograph developed, something strange began to appear, something that shouldn't have been there. Lila was standing beside them, of course, but there was another figure. A pale, ghostly figure, standing in the shadows just behind her, half visible. It was a child, with hollow eyes and a tattered dress. The figure seemed to shimmer like it was made of smoke, never fully in focus, but they're all the same. Matthew's heart skipped a beat when he saw it. Sarah took the photo from his hands, her face paling as she saw the shadow of the child. The strange figure was positioned in the background, blending into the darkness, almost as if it had been hiding in the very earth itself. Is this some sort of trick?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Matthew frowned, turning the photograph in his hands. "It's not possible. I didn't see anyone standing there." They stared at the photo in silence, their thoughts racing. The house, the land, it all felt strange, but the photo made it real in a way words never could. Lila, oblivious to the growing unease between her parents, skipped back to her play. "What's wrong, Mama? Papa?" she asked innocently, her voice the only sound breaking the silence. Sarah quickly plastered a smile on her face. "Nothing, sweetie, just go play for a while." But that night, the unease continued to grow. The next day, the Murphys decided to have the photograph developed again, convinced that it was some sort of trick of the light, or perhaps a smear on the lens. But the result was the same. The pale, eerie child was still there, standing behind Lila, watching from the shadows. This time, Sarah couldn't ignore it. She felt a chill crawl up her spine, the kind of cold that no amount of firewood could chase away. The house felt colder even with the stove burning bright. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the air felt thick with something they couldn't name. Matthew, now visibly shaken, went into town to seek advice. The local innkeeper, an old woman named Miss Eleanor, was sitting by the fire when he arrived, her eyes sharp despite her age. She didn't say much when he explained the situation, only nodded as if she had been waiting for him. "You found her, didn't you?" Miss Eleanor asked in a low voice. "Found who?" Matthew replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The child. The one who appears in photographs. She's been there for as long as anyone can remember, standing just out of sight, always in the shadows. You'll see her, but you'll never know her. Matthew's stomach turned. He had expected many things, but not this. He had heard the rumors, the strange stories that the elders shared in hushed tones. But he never imagined they were true. Miss Eleanor continued, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. She's tied to the land. The land has taken something from her, her life, her childhood, and now she's bound to it. You'll see her in every photograph, in every moment, but she can never leave. No one can. She's a part of this place, and no matter how far you run, she'll always be there. With those words, Matthew's heart sank. He left Miss Eleanor's inn, his mind whirling with thoughts of his daughter and the strange child in the photo. As he walked back to the house, the late afternoon sun seemed to grow dimmer, as if the shadows of the past were starting to stretch across the land once more. When he returned home, Sarah was sitting by the window, staring out into the yard, her face drawn and pale. Lila was playing in the distance, her laughter ringing out once more, but there was something about it now, something that didn't feel quite right. "Sarah, we need to leave," Matthew said urgently, his voice tight with fear. "There's something wrong with this place. We need to leave before it's too late." But Sarah looked at him, her face as cold and empty as the photograph. "It's already too late," she whispered. "She's already here." And as the sun set on Black Hollow, the Murphys realized something that would haunt them for the rest of their days. No matter how far they ran, the child would always appear in their photographs, waiting in the shadows, a reminder of the land's dark secret, one that would never let them go. The land remembers. The days that followed were filled with a strange, suffocating silence. The house, which had once been full of warmth and laughter, now seemed cold and oppressive, as if it too was bound to the mysterious child who appeared in the photographs. Lila no longer played in the yard with the same joy as before. Instead, she wandered the house aimlessly, her eyes vacant, as if something inside her had gone quiet. Her laughter no longer rang through the halls. There were only whispers, the same whispers that filled the house, like shadows that followed her from room to room. Sarah tried to comfort her, tried to bring her back to the little girl she had once been, but no matter how hard she tried, Lila seemed lost, as if the very essence of her had been pulled into the land itself, leaving only a shell behind. Matthew had done everything he could to keep his family safe. He tried to talk to the elders of Black Hollow again, but they refused to speak of the child or the land's curse. They simply muttered warnings under their breath and turned away. No one wanted to remember the stories that had been buried in the past. One night, as Sarah sat by the fire, rocking Lila gently, the child's eyes flickered, just for a moment. Her pupils dilated, and her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was her daughter coming back to her? "Lila," she whispered, her voice trembling. But the child did not respond. Instead, Lila looked up at the photograph on the mantel, a photograph that had been taken the day before they moved into the house. It was the first one they had taken, the one where the mysterious child appeared in the background, half visible in the shadows. Lila's eyes locked onto the photograph, and Sarah felt an icy chill fill the room. For the first time since they arrived, Sarah saw something strange in Lila's eyes. It was as if her daughter recognized something in that photo, something beyond the realm of the living. Lila's small fingers reached up and pointed toward the photo. "That's her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's the one who's been watching me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Who, darling? Who do you mean?" But Lila only shook her head, her lips trembling. "She comes from the shadows. She never leaves." Sarah's heart sank. She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't. But deep down she knew what Lila was saying was true. The child, the one who appeared in the photographs, was no figment of imagination. She was something real. And the land had claimed her long ago, just as it was now claiming Lila. The next morning Matthew took Lila to the woods. He had heard the rumors of an old well deep in the forest, hidden from view by thick trees and tangled vines. Some of the elders spoke of it in hushed tones, but few had dared to venture near. It was said that the well held memories of those who had vanished long ago, swallowed by the land itself. Matthew had to find it. He had to find out what it meant to see the child, to understand the curse that bound them all to this place. They walked for hours, the trees growing thicker around them, the air growing colder as they ventured deeper into the woods. The ground seemed to shift beneath their feet as though it was alive, aware of their presence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they came upon it, the well. It was ancient, made of weathered stone, its surface worn smooth by the passage of time. The air around it felt heavy, like a curtain of silence had descended upon them. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive stillness of something that should not have been disturbed. Lila stood at the edge of the well, her small hands pressed against the stone. She said nothing, her eyes fixed on the darkness inside. Matthew stood beside her, his heart heavy with dread. He knew something had to be done, but he didn't know if he had the strength to face whatever lay at the bottom of that well. "Lila," he said softly, "do you know what's in there?" Lila turned to him, her eyes dark and knowing. "It's where she came from," she whispered. "The shadow child, she's waiting. She's waiting for us." Without warning, Lila leaned forward, her tiny fingers reaching toward the dark abyss of the well. Before Matthew could stop her, she was gone, slipping from his grasp, falling into the blackness below. "Lila!" Matthew screamed, rushing forward, but it was too late. He peered over the edge, his heart pounding in his chest. The darkness swallowed everything. There was no sound, no movement, just the echo of his voice and the oppressive weight of the silence. Desperation gripped him, and he climbed down into the well, his hands shaking as he descended. He reached the bottom, his legs weak with fear, and there in the darkness he found her. Lila lay on the ground, her eyes wide open, staring into the void. But she wasn't the same. Her skin was pale, as though the life had been drained from her. Her body was still, but her eyes, their gaze pierced through him as though they were looking right into his soul. And then, from behind her, a figure appeared. It was the shadow child. The figure was thin, its body wrapped in tattered rags that hung from its frail frame. Its face was pale and hollow, eyes black as coal, and its mouth stretched wide in an eerie grin. It reached out toward Lila, and for a moment, Matthew thought he could hear the soft rustling of leaves, the faint whisper of something that shouldn't have been there. The figure reached for Lila's hand, and before Matthew could react, it spoke, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "She belongs to us now," it said. "Just as you will, soon enough." Matthew's blood ran cold, and he grabbed Lila's limp body, dragging her out of the well with all the strength he had left. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The shadow child's presence was suffocating, and the whispers of the land grew louder, pressing in on him from all sides. He managed to climb back to the surface, gasping for air, Lila's fragile body in his arms. The world around him had changed. The air was colder, the trees darker, and the whispers were everywhere. Lila was not the same. She was silent, her eyes glazed as if the land had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before. And when Matthew looked back at the well, he saw something he couldn't explain. A shadow standing just at the edge, watching. It was the child from the photograph, but now it was clear, it was not just a child. It was something older, something ancient, something that had always been here, waiting. The echoes of Black Hollow. The days following the descent into the well were hazy, like a dream that never quite let go. The air in Black Hollow felt different to Matthew, thicker, heavier, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He had returned with Lila, but she was no longer the girl he remembered. The light in her eyes had dimmed, and she walked as if in a trance, her movements slow, deliberate, like a marionette with tangled strings. At first, he tried everything he could think of. He sought out the town's doctors, their herbalists, their so-called wise women. But every remedy, every suggestion, did nothing. Lila's condition only worsened with each passing day. She would not speak. She would not eat. The house seemed to close in on them, suffocating them both. Aunt Sarah, though desperate to help her daughter, had become just as pale and withdrawn as Lila, as if the land had begun to drain her spirit too. But it was the photographs that truly unsettled him. It started with a simple picture of Lila, taken in the garden. When he developed it, there in the corner of the frame, was the shadow child, clear as day, standing by the old stone well. But now it wasn't just in the shadows. It was reaching out from the photograph, its dark hands seeming to curl around Lila's small form, its eyes staring directly into the lens as though it were alive. The same figure had appeared in every photograph since, the one taken in the house, in the yard, at the dinner table. It was always there, lurking, waiting. Matthew couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape her. The shadow child, who had always been there, hidden in the dark corners of Black Hollow, was now part of their reality. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how many steps he took to escape, the child followed them. One night, after Lila had fallen into a deep, unnatural sleep, Matthew sat alone in the front room, the wind howling outside. He had been staring at the photograph of Lila and the shadow child, studying its details, trying to find some clue, some explanation for the horror they were enduring. That's when he heard it, a soft tapping on the window, barely audible but persistent. He turned, but there was nothing. No branches swaying, no animals passing by. The world outside was as still as the grave. But the tapping continued. His heart began to race. He stood, his legs trembling, and walked toward the window. Through the glass, he could see nothing but the dark outline of the trees, swaying in the wind, the shadows stretched long by the light of the moon. But the tapping, soft and rhythmic, came again. This time it was louder. He drew the curtain back, his breath held tight in his chest. There was nothing. Nothing but the empty yard. The darkness. And then there, just for a moment, he saw it. A figure standing in the shadows, its face pale, its eyes hollow, and that same grin stretching across its face. The child. The one from the photographs. Without thinking, Matthew rushed outside. The cold air bit at his skin as he stepped onto the porch, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. He looked around, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The figure was gone. There was no trace of it, no movement, nothing but the empty land before him. But the air felt different now. The ground beneath him hummed with something ancient, something that had always been here. Something that had waited. Matthew stumbled backward, his mind racing with the realization that the shadow child wasn't just haunting them in photographs. She was haunting them in reality. The land, the house, it was all cursed, bound together by a force older than time itself. As he turned to go back inside, his foot caught on something, a small object lying in the dirt. He bent down, his hand trembling as he picked it up. It was a necklace. The same necklace he had seen in the photograph, the one that Lila had worn. The one that the shadow child had always been connected to. The very same necklace that had been passed down through generations in his wife's family. It had been missing for years, a family heirloom thought to be lost to time. But here it was, lying in the dirt as if waiting for him. A chill ran through him as he held it in his hand, feeling its weight. The gemstone at the center of the necklace gleamed darkly in the moonlight, and as he touched it, he felt an unmistakable pulse. It was as if the necklace itself was alive, feeding on something inside him, something deep within his very soul. The whisper started then. Soft at first, like a rustle in the trees, but then growing louder, until they filled his ears with their clamoring voices. She is ours now. The wind howled again, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. You cannot take her back. She belongs to us. The land has claimed her, just as it claimed Alice. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. Alice, Sarah's sister, who had died so suddenly, so inexplicably, had been the last one to wear the necklace. She had disappeared without a trace, and now Matthew understood. The shadow child, the land, the curse, it was all tied to the necklace. He dropped it. The whispers ceased. In the silence that followed, Matthew rushed back into the house, desperate to find his family. Lila was still asleep, her small body curled tightly in the bed, but Sarah wasn't there. The house felt cold, colder than it had ever been. He searched the rooms, his panic rising, until he finally found her, standing at the window staring out at the dark horizon. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, as if she had become a part of the land itself. She didn't turn when Matthew entered, and he knew without a doubt that she was lost to them now, just as Lila had been. Sarah? He whispered, his voice barely audible. She turned slowly, and when she looked at him, her eyes were no longer her own. They were the eyes of the shadow child, empty and knowing, watching him with a cold, ancient gaze. It's too late, Matthew, Sarah whispered. She's already ours. And as Matthew stood in the doorway, his heart breaking, he knew that the curse had claimed them all. The land of Black Hollow had taken what it wanted, and no one, not even the Murphys, would ever escape its grasp. The photograph, the necklace, the shadow child, they were all part of something much darker than he could ever have imagined.